I'd like to introduce our panelists today. We have the Honorable Dr. Vivienne Poy, Landy Anderson, Arlene Chan, and Willie Woo. And each panelist will present their opening remarks for 5 minutes with questions to follow. And please try to stick to the allotted time because we only have 1 hour and we want to make sure that we get all the information out there and we don't miss anything. But first, I'd like to introduce Alan Lam, who's the chair of the Chinese Cultural Center, to deliver opening remarks. Over to you, Alan.
Hello, my name is Alan Lam, the chairman of the Chinese Cultural Center of Greater Toronto. Funding from the Ministry of Education made this online forum possible. I'm very grateful and thankful for all the 4 speakers who will be introduced later, and the students who will be engaging in dialogue to promote our awareness of the head tax and the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1923, or the Chinese Exclusion Act. Today, we hope that we can all learn from the speakers, and some are descendants of the head taxpayers and all the railway, the road workers. I believe that only when we learn from our past mistakes, we can move forward to a better tomorrow collectively. So let's learn together. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Alan. So our first panelist, which will open her remarks, is the Honorable Dr. Vivienne Poy. Dr. Poy is a former senator of the Senate of Canada. In fact, she was the very first senator of Asian ancestry in Canada, and the person responsible for putting forward the motion declaring May as Asian Heritage Month in Canada. She also happens to be my mother. So go ahead, the mic is yours.
Okay. Students, this year is the 100th anniversary of the passage of the Act Respecting Chinese Immigration, commonly known as Chinese Exclusion Act. Why was this legislation passed by Parliament in 1923, targeting the only ethnic group entering British North America? This is a significant part of Canadian history, and if you haven't learned about it by now, you will today. The Chinese first came to Canada in 1788. They were contract workers and shipwrights brought here from Macau to Nootka Sound by Captain John Muir to build ships and the first year-round British fur trading settlement, which helped to consolidate British claim to the Pacific Northwest. At that time, Britain was at war with Spain over the fur trade. And what happened to those workers subsequently was not recorded. During the 19th century, there was a large increase in population in South China, and there wasn't enough land to feed the people. Life was harsh for the peasants, and since Canton, which is now known as Guangzhou, was an open port for foreign trade, it was easy for contractors to recruit laborers to work overseas. Chinese workers were brought to the West Coast to clear forests, build trails, work in the salmon canneries and lumber yards. In 1848, gold was discovered in California and later in the Fraser Valley. In 1858, tens of thousands of gold prospectors poured into the West Coast, including the Chinese. North America came to be known as Gold Mountain in China. Due to the huge numbers of American gold prospectors in the Fraser Valley, and British Columbia was cut off from the rest of Canada by the Rocky Mountains, there was fear that the province would join the United States. On July 1st, 1867, Canada became the Dominion of Canada. And in order to connect the new confederation from coast to coast, a railway needed to be built through the Rockies. In 1881, the Canadian Pacific Railway was incorporated. Contractors brought in tens of thousands of Chinese laborers, particularly to build the most difficult part of the railroad through the Fraser Canyon. Despite the objections from the Western MPs to the influx of Chinese workers because of fear of labor competition, Prime Minister Sir John A. Macdonald said in Parliament, "If you want the railroad, you have to have Chinese labor." Then in 1885, upon the completion of the CPR, when Chinese laborers were no longer needed, Parliament passed an act to restrict and regulate Chinese immigration, imposing a $50 head tax to control the entry of Chinese to Canada. That amounted to equal what a laborer was able to save up in 1 year. It is important to note how badly the Chinese, who had contributed so much to the building of Canada, were treated. When the famous photo, "The Last Spike," was taken on November 7, 1885, Chinese laborers were nowhere to be seen, even though they were the ones who had made the completion of the railroad possible. In 1900, to further restrict the entry of Chinese into Canada, the head tax was increased to $100. And in 1903, the head tax was again increased to $500. Despite the hefty head tax, Chinese kept coming to Canada because they were able to make more money than back home in China. Their head tax was financed by relatives or villagers, with the hope of raising the standard of living of the entire community back home. This is not unlike human migration. Since the beginning of time, people will always go where they can make a better living. Severe discrimination rose from fear of competition from the Chinese because they were hardworking, frugal, and often willing to work for less pay. The media used the fact that they look different, have different languages and habits, and therefore easy targets. In 1923, an act respecting Chinese immigration, 100 years ago, it is also known as the Chinese Exclusion Act, was passed. And as of July 1st, Chinese were not allowed to enter Canada, with very few exceptions. That day came to be known as Humiliation Day to the Chinese in Canada. From then on, until the repeal of Chinese exclusion after the Second World War, these Chinese communities of sad, lonely bachelors grew old without their families. There was much suffering, both in China and in Canada. Now you hear from the descendants of these families.
Great, thank you very much. I would like to now introduce Landy Anderson. Landy is the granddaughter of a Toisan Chinese head taxpayer. Her grandfather, Mr. Ralph Long Ki Li, was one of the last living head taxpayers to receive our Prime Minister's apology on June 22nd, 2006. Landy has been a member of the foundation to commemorate the Chinese railroad workers in Canada since 2011, and in 2019, she became the chair of the foundation to commemorate the Chinese railroad workers in Canada. Landy, all yours.
Hi, everyone. It's so nice to have you all here. I know how precious your time is. And thank you to Dr. Poy for the lovely summarize the lovely summary of the history. And I actually, lovely is maybe not the right word, because it's a very complex history and a dark history. And apart from the fact that there were discriminatory and legislated discrimination against Chinese people, our government is taking responsibility, and they did apologize. Our former Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, on June 22nd, 2006, he did apologize on behalf of Canada for the discrimination for that terrible head tax. And Dr. Poy talked about how that head tax was increasing to try to keep Chinese people out of Canada. And I really like that she mentioned how Chinese people, like every person, we're just trying to keep the lights on, folks. We're trying to put food on the table. And Chinese people came over here chasing gumsan and Gold Mountain. And sorry, my Chinese is very poor. I've lost it over the years. So that was my grandfather, because everyone came over, and it started with the prospectors mining for gold, and it ended up with everybody else decades later wanting to come over. And for families and communities, Dr. Poy said families and communities put their money together to pay the head tax. So my grandfather, Ralph Lunke Lee, was born in 1900. And he was 12 years old. And I know these are high school students in the room, but 12 years old. And he had two of his cousins, 8 and 9 years old, along with them, with tags around their neck with their names. And they all came over literally on a slow boat from China. And they got to this foreign land, Canada, because their relatives put them on this boat, thinking it was going to be a better life for them in Canada. And this was after the Japanese War. And so lots of Chinese came here to have a better life for their families. And my grandfather got here, he was 12 years old, and he had to wash dishes. He didn't go to school, he washed dishes. And it took him 5 years to pay off that head tax. And Dr. Poy talked about that head tax being increased up to $500, which is the equivalent of 2 houses. And so instead of going to school, and I know the students, it's a full-time job to go to school. My grandfather didn't go to school. He washed dishes for 5 years. And then he worked on the railway, because at that time, the railway was good money. And if you think about the Sir John A. Macdonald, our first prime minister, he said, as Dr. Poy mentioned in her opening remarks, the railway cannot be built without Chinese labor. And so we imported 80,000 Chinese laborers to Canada. And to build the railroad, well, we imported 17,000 to build the railway, and about 4,000 died from the building of the railway. So that's 1 in every 4 Chinese railroad worker died from the treacherous labor conditions and from poor nutrition and disease. And they were emotionally and physically abused. It was terrible. So that's why I'm the chair of the foundation, to commemorate the Chinese railroad workers in Canada, so that we don't forget these stories. You know, our ancestors fell off the cliffs and in the Fraser Valley, and they were just left there to die. And when the railway was built, they started the head tax to keep people out of Canada. That's not very nice. If you're having invite 17,000 people to come over, and then 80,000 come over and pay the head tax. We paid to build the railway, folks. 80,000 people paid the head tax, and we paid to build the railway our own selves. So when our prime minister finally apologized, when Canada did the right thing on June 22nd, 2006, my family carried the ceremonial last spike, and we carried it on the Redress Express, the Via Rail, and the train started in Vancouver, and the First Nations came and drummed us onto the train, and we carried that spike, and the elders, our Chinese elders, and the living head taxpayers, there was only 6 of them that were on that train, and my grandpa was one of them. And James Pon, who's the founder of the foundation to commemorate the Chinese railroad workers in Canada, it's like way too many words to say. We call it FCCRWC. and you can Google us and you can look at our website and you can learn more. FCCRWC, and it's up there under my picture. Well, actually, I'm live, so it's not my picture. It's up there under me. But so then, like I said, Canada excluded everyone, and on the train, Pierre Burton, and he is the best writer in all of Canada, and he writes, well, next to Arlene Chan, of course, who you'll hear from next. But Pierre Burton writes about our Chinese history, and he had a ceremonial spike. He had two of them actually, and he gifted one to the Chinese community, and our elders carried that spike. And the train came across from Vancouver to Toronto, and then I wheeled my grandpa. At that time, he was 106 years old. He was still alive. He was the oldest living head taxpayer, and he was alive, and our family carried that spike. And my grandpa, this is the front page of the Toronto Star, and it was literally the picture that was on the front page of every major newspaper in all of Canada on June 22nd, 2006. And we went to the railway room, the same room that Sir John A. Macdonald, and I'm 4 minutes, I've got one more minute, but we went to the railway room, the same room that the first prime minister made the decision to use Chinese labor to finish the railway, because the railway wouldn't get built without us. And what happened was, we got the apology and we presented that spike, the ceremonial spike that Pierre Burton gave us, and we presented that to Stephen Harper, and as an acknowledgement that he had done the right thing. And Dr. Pon mentioned that on November 7, 1885, there were no Chinese men in that picture. That is perhaps one of the most iconic pictures in all of Canada, the hammering of that last spike. And think about it. There isn't a school here that has 17,000 kids in it. If there is a school, maybe I'm mistaken, and then you can correct me. I'm easy to find. Just come to the foundation and you can find me and correct me. But think about it, 17,000 people, that would fill a couple football fields of the amount of people that died to build the railway. So on July 1st, it is Humiliation Day, and the foundation has I'm bringing this to a close, it's my 5 minutes. The foundation has a campaign to collect premier letters of support and to show their support. And our Prime Minister sent a letter of support and acknowledgement. All the premiers from across Canada, a number of them, sent letters of support to the foundation for July 1st because it's 100 years of the Chinese Exclusion Act. Kids, we're living history. I don't know how many 100-year anniversaries you'll ever live through, but we're going to live through this anniversary. And on that day, it's not going to be the Canadian Pacific Railway. We are proclaiming July 1st to be Chinese People's Railroad Day, CPR Day. CPR Day is not going to be the Canadian Pacific Railway. We built that railroad, and we are going to reclaim it just for one day. We know it's Canadian Pacific Railway, but on that one day. So I've put in a link in the chat, and in that chat, you will see we've got these proclamations from capital cities across Canada to proclaim July 1st, CPR Day. And also BC, the foundation, us, we asked BC to proclaim Chinese Railroad Worker Memorial Day, the very first Chinese People's Memorial Railroad, Chinese Railroad Worker Memorial Day, the very first. And I'm sorry, it's the first time anyone's ever done this, and we did that. So my closing comment as I bring my 5 minutes to a close, teachers, please invite me, Landy Anderson, the chair, to come and speak. I have when Vivienne, Dr. Poy spoke about the history, I have a presentation about the relations between Chinese people and Indigenous people because I'm mixed heritage my own self, Chindigenous, and I will come and do that presentation for you and your students. And I'm all over, so it's easy for me to do on Zoom or Microsoft Teams, number one. And number two, kids, I know it's hard. You think that you are not part of this 100-year history. Who even knows Sir John A. Macdonald? Hopefully you remember that from your history class. But the history of the railway is not 100 years. It's living and breathing today. We wouldn't have this economic freedom and privileges that we have without the railway. And we've got some great little 3-minute videos. I invite you to make little videos and win $200 or $300, and you do it every year. And I'll put the link in the chat, because then you can make a video and I'll show you this year's winner. He's beautiful. It's a 3-minute video and it's a beautiful, and I'll put that in the chat for you. So thank you, everybody. I need more time. I teach part-time at Trent University here in Ontario, and 5 minutes is not enough. I can lecture for an hour, easy. You give me the mic. So I've got to drop the mic here, folks. Okay. Thank you, everybody. I love you all for being here. And a shout out to Sachet. They do beautiful work. Mahesh, the executive director of Sachet, is here supporting, because the Sachet supports the Indigenous community and the Chinese community. Thank you, folks.
Thank you very much, Landy. Next, I want to introduce Arlene Chan. So Arlene and her famous family are pretty much a household name in the Chinese Canadian community. Her mother, Jean Lum, was the first restaurateur and the first Chinese woman to ever receive the Order of Canada, which is our nation's second highest civilian honor of merit. Arlene has carried on the work of her mother. She is an author, a Chinatown historian, and the president of the Jean Lum Foundation. Arlene, over to you.
Thank you very much, Justin. I'm so pleased to be here. And I just want to share some stories about how the head tax and the Chinese Exclusion Act affected my family. And I'm going to start with my grandparents. On my mother's side, my grandfather came to Canada in 1899, over 120 years ago. And at the time that he came, the head tax was at $50. And a few years later, he was able to bring over my grandmother. And at that time, the head tax was $100. And then my father came from China in 1921. And by the time he came, the head tax was $500. So my father dreamed of bringing over his parents and his family to come to Canada. But 2 years after my father arrived, the Chinese Exclusion Act was implemented. So he never realized his dream, and I never got to meet my grandparents or any family members on my father's side. My mother's family life was totally different. And so she came from a family with 12 brothers and sisters. And it was very unusual at that time for there to be such a large family, again, because of the head tax and the Exclusion Act. And most of the Chinese in those early years, as was mentioned by Dr. Poy, were men because they couldn't bring over their families. And I can think of in Toronto, the ratio of men to women was 18-1. So if you're in a class of 30 students, you would only have 2 or 3 girl students in your class. So just to give you an idea of that ratio. So this, of course, was the result of the head tax and the Exclusion Act. So my mother grew up in at the most when anti-Chinese discrimination was at its worst, and you've heard the information about the head tax and Exclusion Act, but there were over 100 anti-Chinese policies and laws in place that really restricted where Chinese could live, where they could work, where they could even spend their leisure time. And I'm thinking of my mother, all the years that the 6 kids in our family tried to teach my mother how to swim. And it wasn't until very recently that I learned why my mother couldn't swim. She never told us why, but it was because in those early years, Chinese people were not allowed to go into the public swimming pool. So that's just one of the many policies that were in place. So my mother and her family lived in Chinatown, and that's where the Chinese people could live together, help each other, support each other. But it was also safety in numbers against being bullied and beaten up. She had to go to a segregated school with that was only for Chinese, Japanese, and Indigenous children. And so at this very early age, she questioned why she couldn't go to the regular school like all the other children. And she wondered why she was being treated so differently. Why was she outside the circle? And so this early experience was something that really influenced her for the rest of her life. How to change things so that Chinese people could be included and accepted into Canadian life and not segregated and discriminated against. So my mother rose above all the challenges that she faced as a person growing up and broke many glass ceilings. And what this means is that she was the first Chinese Canadian to do and accomplish many things. And against all odds, she helped to change the immigration laws that separated families. She helped to save Toronto's Chinatown, and she spoke up against injustices against the Chinese people, and she was a spokesperson and a leader in the community. And for her extensive work, and as was mentioned, she was the first Chinese Canadian woman and the first restaurateur ever to be named to the Order of Canada, a huge honor. So here we are in 2023. Thankfully, so much has changed since 1923, and we have so much to celebrate. Like my mother, Chinese Canadians have broken glass ceilings. And we have senators, councillors, members of parliament, mayors, writers, designers, activists, and so on. And even on the screen, we see Asian actors like we've never seen before. And I think of Simu Liu being Marvel's first Asian superhero. And we have a Chinese Canadian archive, Chinese Canadian museum. We have college and university courses. These were things that I couldn't have even imagined that we would have in this time. Canada is a country of immigrants, and we've all come from another place at one time or another to join the Indigenous peoples who were here thousands of years before we first started arriving here. And we may not look the same. Our parents, our grandparents may not have come from the same country, but we all share similar hopes and dreams that are universal across race and identity. That is, that we all want the best for our families. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Arlene. I would now like to introduce our fourth panelist, Willie Woo. Willie is the Regional Councillor for Wards 3 and 4 in the region of Durham, and also holds the position of Deputy Mayor of Clarington. Willie's family came over to Canada during the same time period, and he has very vivid memories of life for Chinese Canadians at that time, having witnessed as a child how hard his parents worked in their family restaurant. Willie, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Justin, for that introduction. And Deja Hall, hello, everyone. I would like to thank the Chinese Cultural Center of Greater Toronto and the Ministry of Education for providing us with this opportunity of 100 years of history, remembering the Chinese Exclusion Act. I will try and recount my remembrance and experience as through the eyes of a child and lived experiences.
In Canada and are here to do their best.
There's some background noise.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
My father was born in 1889 in the province of Guangdong in the area of Hoi Ping. After the last spike was struck at the end of the Canadian Pacific Railway, using Chinese men as slave laborers, the Canadian government charged a head tax of $50 in 1985 on all Chinese immigrants entering Canada, which was increased to $100 in 1900 and $500 in 1903. The purpose of this levy was plainly discriminatory, to prevent Chinese immigrants from taking jobs away from other Canadians. The government also imposed other legislative restrictions on owning property and even limited their choice of occupation. It was during this period when my father came to Canada, or otherwise known as Gold Mountain, in 1911. At the age of 22, he arrived in Vancouver, was subject to the head tax. The $500 head tax my father paid was about the equivalent of 2 years' salary, or could have either purchased a house or at least a good down payment of a house in Vancouver. Unfortunately, I was not able to find out much of my father's past, and for that matter, my mother's past, other than from pictures, other mementos, and tidbits of information. While in Canada, pictures show my father as part of the Chinese bachelor community. My mom was born in 1913 in Hoi Ping. During the time, my dad was in Canada working as a cheap laborer and sending whatever meager earnings back home. There are two sides of this story. My father was one of many men who were in this country without their parents, spouse, children, extended family, and likewise, my mom was in China during a very depressed time in China's history, and with the invasion by the Japanese during the 1940s, with no way of entering Canada with a Chinese Exclusion Act in place. Communication was not what it was like today, with cell phones, landlines, Skype, Zoom, Microsoft Teams. Letter writing was sent by airmail and with a turnaround time of probably about a month. From the photos of my dad, he strikes quite an imposing figure. That is my dad. From some of the artifacts I've been able to locate, he worked for Tip Top Tailors in Toronto and had an import-export business in Halifax. He pretty well traversed this great country. Mom lived in China during the most horrific times with the Japanese invasion. Sometimes after the war, my dad traveled back to China. I can only assume what my dad was that was when my dad was formally introduced to who would eventually be my mom. This more than likely was considered an arranged marriage. My dad returned to Canada sometime in and around 1950 with his or their son. My mom and another son would immigrate to Canada and join him in 1952. They settled in Peterborough, Ontario, with my dad working in a Chinese restaurant. In 1954, a special occasion occurred with the birth of another son, that being me. Dad was 65 and mom was 41 when their golden child was born. And that year, we moved to a little village of Newcastle, 100 kilometers east of Toronto. Mom and dad opened a restaurant serving Chinese and Canadian food. We lived at the back of the restaurant. Even as a child, I had a bird's eye view of how hard they both worked. Up at 6 a.m., getting ready for the breakfast crowd and finishing the day at about midnight. This went on for pretty well 365 days a year with few exceptions. I also have a sister who was born in 1956. At that time, my dad was probably one of the few collecting a pension check and a baby bonus check. While we were the only Chinese family in Newcastle, we had a mix of people from Ukraine, Hungary, Poland, England, Holland. At that time, Newcastle was a little village of about 800 people. We were all from working class families, and for the most part, we all got along irrespective of our background and nationality. The restaurant was the hangout for most of the teenagers. Mom and dad were much loved, especially mom. In fact, those baby boomers formerly remember mom as Mama Woo. Dad was the head of the family and mom was the dutiful housewife. I remember those early years in the 60s traveling to other communities, such as Bowmanville, Peterborough, Coburg, visiting with other Chinese families, and taking a bag of oranges for a gift. There were times when I was taken out of school to make a trip to Chinatown in Toronto. That was when Chinatown was centered around Elizabeth Street and Dundas Street. Dad would go into the CIBC bank and meet with the bank manager, Mr. Walker, and get his accounts updated. My dad picked up his supplies from Mongok Trading Company. Their bookkeeper, Tommy, of Japanese descent, would be someone I could always speak to. We would go either to Sai Wu Restaurant or Guang Chao Restaurant. I fondly remember my favorite dishes, har gao, su mai, and cha xiao bao. If we ate at Guang Chao, I remember fondly Arlene's mom. Jean Lum. This was also the time when the new City Hall was being built. Growing up, we lived in the back of the restaurant. There were 2 rooms for sleeping quarters. I slept in this room, same room as my dad, and my sister slept in the same room with my mom. Now, that may be the reason why there was no other children after us. They didn't interact with the community as much as I would have liked. I wish my dad would accompany me to activities such as Boy Scouts and Cubs, school concerts, sporting events. Unfortunately, while I might have been selfish, this was not something they were used to. This was not a part of their culture. Mom and Dad understood working hard with long hours was the way they could get ahead and provide his children with a better life. They never, ever complained. They were proud Canadian citizens. They lived the dream. When I was 19, Dad passed away on March 28, 1973, at the age of 84, which left my mom as a single parent with 2 teenage kids living in a small community where she did not speak English. She could have moved to Toronto, lived in one of the Chinatowns, Broadview and Gerrard, or Spadina and Dundas, but she chose to live in Newcastle and run the restaurant alone. I think this helped Mom occupy her time and help with the grieving process. The elderly ladies who knew my mom got together in the restaurant for coffee and helped Mom if Mom got busy. Mom sold the restaurant in 1983, but kept very busy with her home. Her vegetable and flower gardens kept her busy, and the ladies drew her into their circle. Besides watching Fairchild Channel, she loved watching wrestling and her beloved Toronto Maple Leafs. Her favorite player was Dave Keon. Mom would spend hours baking and cooking, especially for the Chinese New Year's. Old traditions never die. Mom loved her children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. Mom had a fantastic memory and knew everyone's name and birthday. As I mentioned earlier, I am a second-generation Canadian-born Chinese, or CBC. As much as I tried to whitewash myself growing up, I respected my parents' tradition. In fact, I embraced my Chinese heritage and all that comes with it. When I was elected on Clareton Council in 2006, my mom was over the moon. Never in her wildest dreams was something like this possible in her family. In the early 2000s, I followed the Chinese Canadian National Council and the Ontario Coalition of Head Taxpayers and Families, petitioning the government to recognize the injustices done to the Chinese immigrants with the discriminatory Chinese head tax and the notorious Chinese Exclusion Act, and to apologize for the financial hardship and family separation. In order to build a society that celebrates diversity and protects every individual's right to equality, it was imperative that the Canadian government redress the regrettable legacy and apologize to the victims of Canada's Chinese Head Tax and Exclusion Act. In 2005, Inky Mark, MP, Dolphin Swan River, and the Honorable Bev Oda, Member of Parliament for Durham, which is in my writing, introduced a private member's bill recognizing the historical mistreatment of Chinese Canadians. I, along with many families of the head taxpayer and interested parties, were in the House of Commons June 22nd, 2006, when Prime Minister Stephen Harper made the head tax apology and redress. My mom was overjoyed as she was the spouse of a head taxpayer. In order that past mistakes are not repeated, future generations must know the truth about Canadian history. Being in front of you, education is one of the keys to solving this problem. I thank the Chinese Cultural Centre of Greater Toronto and the Ministry of Education to tell our story through our lived experiences and to make sure that inaccurate history is taught. That accurate history is taught in our schools and in our homes. History can repeat itself, so we must always be vigilant. Ultimately, being involved in your community and getting involved politically are ways to ensure that past wrongs will not be repeated. So to all members of the younger generation, please keep in mind and play an active role in Canada's future. Shashay, Miigwech. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Willie. I'm now going to ask a few questions. We have some questions that we need to put forward to our panelists. This is for Dr. Poy. What is the significance of the Exclusion Act in terms of what it tells you about Canada at that time? And why do all Canadians need to learn about this period in our country's history?
That's a very important question.
Yes.
The Exclusion Act, as I mentioned when I did the introduction, was targeting one specific ethnic group coming into Canada. That has never happened before or since. Why the Chinese? Chinese have been, well, as I mentioned, since the 18th century, Chinese had been here. Chinese are known as good workers. Every country needs good workers. And why should they be discouraged? It's, competition is very good for every country. And we should always encourage competition instead of putting those down who are very competitive. And Chinese have always been known as hard workers and very competitive. And it's something that if students don't learn about it today, that dark period of Canadian history can repeat itself. And it must not, because the next time, if it should happen, it could be any group, absolutely any group, because other groups, other ethnic groups have also gone through extreme discrimination. And at that time, 100 years ago, it was the Chinese. But at any time, it can be anybody. And it is not good for Canada. If Canada needs to move ahead and be prosperous, we need good people in this country working and competing, not only competing with each other, but competing with the rest of the world. And that is why it's extremely, extremely important for everyone to know about this part of the Canadian history.
Great, thank you. Arlene, what is the, in your opinion, what are some of the biggest differences between the Chinese community and the immigrants that came during the time of your mother versus the immigrants that we see in more modern times from coming over from China and Hong Kong and other Asian countries?
I have to say that up until the 1960s, the Chinese community in Canada was relatively small, again, because of the Head Tax and Exclusion Act. And it wasn't until, even though the Exclusion Act was repealed in 1947, it took another 20 years before all the clauses that were really preventing family reunification were removed. And so 1967 is when Canada totally revamped the immigration law so that the Chinese could now apply to come to Canada on equal footing as immigrants coming from other parts of the world. And what that did was it really changed our Chinese community, because up until 1967, it was a very homogeneous community, because most of the Chinese came from that province of Guangdong, which is in the south part of China, and they spoke a common language, they shared common traditions, shared the same kinds of foods and traditions. But after 1967, at one point, Hong Kong became the largest source of immigrants coming into Canada. And then China was the largest source of immigrants coming into Canada. And so what we saw in the Chinese community, not only growing exponentially, very, very large, to being one that is very, very diverse as we see today. So, even if you're from China, you're from the north, the west, the east, or the south, people coming from Singapore, Taiwan, from all over the world. And so this Chinese community that we have now is so diverse, and you really get to enjoy the richness of that diversity, especially if you go to Chinatown and you get to sample and eat all the different Chinese cuisines that there are available to us. So it's a very, very big difference. And the fact that the Chinese, with all the legislation that has changed, that the Chinese are now involved in all walks of life, which was something that wasn't happening definitely up into World War II. So it's a very, very big change of the profile of the Chinese community then and now.
Great. Thank you very much, Arlene. Landy, you are, probably more in touch with your ancestry than many people. How has your Chinese ancestry and knowing so much about your family history molded and shaped who you are as a Canadian today?
Thank you for that. So, and it's interesting that my kids talk about our social political history on the two sides of the family, on the Chinese side and on the Indigenous side. And I walk in two cultural worlds, but actually it's three cultural worlds. So I walk in the Chinese world, or the Chinese community, the Indigenous community, and also I walk in the Canadian community, so which makes me quite comfortable in my own skin wherever I am. And for me, it just it's shaped my life. First of all, I never thought that I would be a public speaker, number one, or a teacher in the post-secondary education system, or the chair of the foundation to commemorate the Chinese railroad workers in Canada. I didn't realize that I had this voice. And just like many of the students here, I didn't feel connected to my history. And I didn't understand my history. And it's actually kind of embarrassing. But because I was busy during my birthing years having children, and I'm a former foster parent, so I stayed at home looking after kids. And I was just a mother looking after my own kids and other people's children. And I had an awakening, epiphany. And it was the day I was in a Chinese restaurant with my grandfather, and he was Ngeilong, which is in Toisan, it's hard of hearing. And I was talking to him in Toisan, and the cooks came out and said, "Your grandpa must be a head taxpayer." And I'm like, "What?" I said, "Grandpa, are you a head taxpayer?" And my grandpa never talked about it because it's that shameful part of the past, like the same way that Arlene talked about her grandma or her mother not being able to swim in a public pool. Like that really bothers me, that was the life that our ancestors lived. And I have to control myself so I'm not overwhelmed hearing these stories of our dark and complex history and this legislated racism that only Chinese people, when Willie was talking about his who paid the head tax, only Chinese people were excluded and discriminated against. And so for me, it lights a fire in me to stand up for social justice. So I went to school for my mass social work and a master in education, because the education system is the biggest system that constructs and helps to shape, next to the family system, but the education system is so important. And so this awakening in me, and then going to school and studying, anyways, I'll be short, so I'll save some airtime for other people. But Justin, that was a great question, because this is the ecosystem that we live in, and the belief of the ecological system that contributes to construct your social identity. And what does that mean for the children in the room is that the influence of the family, the influence of the community, the influence of the school system, and all of those influences really do set a pathway for a trajectory of how you're going to grow up, and the big person that you're going to be, and what are those things you're going to be. And I don't know, this touches you and you're interested in it, learn more about it. And teachers, your job is to just bring those stories to the classroom, and the children and the youth will decide what story touches them, and they'll be advocates for education, or advocates for poverty, or advocates for housing, or they'll be in politics like Dr. Poy here, or they will be in positions to shape the landscape of the future based on the stories that we share with them today. Something will touch them in their hearts, and I don't know what that is, but thanks, Justin.
Great, thank you very much, Landy. So Willie, carrying on from what Landy was saying, what do you think, I mean, from not just a formal education standpoint, but what do you think today's Chinese Canadian youth can do to more or less honor the efforts of our ancestors that overcame a lot of adversity against all odds early on in Canada?
Yeah, thank you very much, Justin, for that great question. We look at what's happening now in our country, and we talked about maybe you don't have the head tax, but when I look at exclusion, whether it's legislated or not, we're seeing many things happen within our community. When you look at the separation of families, if I look at those that were coming to this country as far as immigration, those that are coming into this country, whether it be war-torn countries, whether they're, if I look at Ukraine, the separation of bringing people over here, and for our youth, and again, we're speaking to, well, in fact, I would say the youth are our future. The ones that are watching now take a great interest in what's happening. Try to distill what is truth and what is not the truth, because there is so much going on nowadays that we're being told how to think as opposed to making decisions after good research and looking at what is taking place in this world. And if we don't, we just have to look at what has taken place to the south of us, how this far right group has taken over. We're seeing some of that here in Canada now. And again, I said before, my parents came to this country, they worked hard, they never complained. This is a land of opportunity. They lived the dream. And we hope that others that do come to this country feel the same way, that this is a great country where if you work hard, you can achieve immeasurable success. So again, Justin, when I look at my time growing up and watching my parents as role models, respecting the past, but appreciating where I am now and the future, I hope our kids, and I'm trying to do that with my children and my great-grandchildren. They know about their heritage. Embrace that heritage, whatever background that you are. We are a country made up of different cultures and nationalities, but we are Canadians.
Great, thank you very much, Willie. Arlene, seeing how much progress we still have some ways to go, but how much progress the Chinese community has made here in Canada. What do you think, and I know your husband, Leo, is one of our great chefs. What do you think your mom would think seeing the level of Chinese cuisine right now here in Canada?
Oh, she would be so impressed. And my parents, as Willie mentioned, that he went to my parents' restaurant, the Kwong Chow restaurant, which was in our first Chinatown here in Toronto. And I have to, the Chinese restaurants that opened up after World War II were very different from all the Chinese restaurants that had been in business just before the war. They were much smaller, and many of them were just in Chinatown. But what happened after World War II is, with the opening of restaurants like the Lychee Garden, Sai Wu, my parents' restaurant, Kwong Chow restaurant, they really served what we know now is Chinese Canadian food. And, people today kind of look down on Chinese Canadian food. Well, that's not real Chinese food, but I can't tell you enough how much that really bridged our Chinese community, which was really segregated up until World War II. It really bridged our Chinese community with the larger community because people really wanted to eat Chinese Canadian food. It was Chinese food adapted for the Western palate. And so that turned Chinatown from a place to avoid. The Chinese restaurants that opened there turned Chinatown into a destination rather than a place to avoid. And so with my mother being so involved in those early years of serving Chinese Canadian food, and then she lived long enough. She passed away in 2002, but she could see the results of all the Chinese immigrants who were coming here and bringing their chefs and bringing their taste for different types of Chinese food. And the variety of food that we get here is, she would be just so proud and amazed. And that's one thing I wanted just to say about my mom is that, you know, as much as I talked about her having lived through the worst times in our Canadian history, in times of discrimination and racism, she always had this very, very positive outlook. And so for her, even looking at what we have today, what we are having in terms of food and variety of restaurants and all the services that we're getting here, she would be so, so proud to know that we've come so far from those early years. So, and I just want to emphasize how much Chinese food has been a really driving force to bring Chinese Canadians into the mainstream of life. And for people, I mean, how do you learn about each other? It doesn't matter if you're originally from Japan or from China or from wherever. Food is really such a universal, commonly enjoyed culture. And so Chinese food was really and remains to this day, such a great way for people to learn about Chinese food, our culture, our traditions, like through Chinese New Year or Dragon Boat Festival or the Mid-Autumn Festival. So thank you for asking that question, Justin.
Right. Yeah, you're right. I mean, festivals and food are some of the things that the first things that most Canadians know about the Chinese culture. So this is from our friend Wilbert Lai. Wilbert says, a very educational and enlightening forum. Thanks. What are our expectations on educational institutions, government agencies, including the Parliament, community groups and leaders, for using this knowledge and take the next steps to foster a genuine and successful Canada of the true multiculturalism in practice and doing, free of biases and systemic discrimination? Now, I think if any of you had an immediate answer, then we would solve probably 100 years of problems in less than 2 minutes. So I think this is a work in progress. I actually, you know, the fact that the Ministry of Education had commissioned the Chinese Culture Center of Greater Toronto to even do this project, I think that's a great start. But obviously, we still have a lot more work to go. This from Jack Leung. Jack is with York University. Thanks for the meaningful and wonderful remarks about the Chinese Exclusion Act and the building of the railroad. There's a question for Dr. Poy, a follow-up to a question I had asked. What can Canadians learn from this part of Canadian history in building a diverse and multicultural society? So perhaps you can answer that.
Okay. The most important thing is that to know, for the next generation to know what had happened in the past and make sure the bad part of the history is never repeated. I think that is extremely, extremely important. And politicians need to pay attention. And of course, if Canadians don't want anything like that to happen again, they need to vote for the right politicians to represent us. Very, very important. And for Canadians, those of us who want to speak up, we need to speak up continuously against what is not good for the country, because I really believe that Canada has a wonderful future with the multicultural character of this country. And if we want to be progressive and we want to be moving forward, never would move back. So we need to use everyone, all the human resources that we have of of every Canadian to move forward. And in order to do that, we absolutely cannot discriminate against anyone in this country.
Great. Thank you very much. I do have to close this out. And thank you to our 4 panelists for, this has been such great insight, especially those to our descendants from the early Chinese pioneers to Canada. Thank you everyone for attending and taking the time to sign in today. I want to thank the Chinese Cultural Centre of Greater Toronto for hosting this, and of course the Ministry of Education for supporting this entire project and for bringing this important piece of Canadian history to the students in Ontario. Thank you very much and have a great afternoon, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.